The screens went dark at 0347 hours. Nina Gray watched 6 green dots disappear from her monitor simultaneously, her coffee growing cold as she stared at the blank display. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, 6 of the military's most elite operators had just vanished without a trace. The brass was panicking, backup comms were failing, and everyone was looking at her, the woman they'd told to stay behind and monitor from safety. What they didn't know was that Nina had been preparing for this moment her entire career, and buried deep in the Pentagon's archives was a satellite network that hadn't been touched in 20 years. A network that only she knew how to access. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like any other at the Joint Operations Center in Quantico. Nina Gray sat at her workstation, adjusting the brightness on her triple monitor setup, while the pre-dawn darkness pressed against the reinforced windows. She'd been with the Defense Intelligence Agency for 8 years, specializing in satellite communications and signal intelligence, but today felt different. Today, Operation Blackbird was launching, and for the first time in her career, she wouldn't be going with the team. "Gray, you're staying put," Colonel Harrison had announced during the briefing 3 days prior. His weathered face showed no emotion as he gestured toward the mission parameters displayed on the wall-mounted screen. "This is a high-risk insertion. We need someone reliable monitoring comms from base." The words stung more than Nina cared to admit. She'd trained alongside these men, had proven herself in simulation after simulation, but when it came to real deployment, she was always the one left behind. The team consisted of 6 operators from different branches, each hand-picked for their unique skills. There was Rodriguez from the Navy SEAL, a communications specialist whose calm demeanor masked a razor-sharp intellect. Captain Blake led the Army Rangers contingent, his tactical expertise legendary among special operations circles. The Air Force had sent Technical Sergeant Cooper, whose electronic warfare capabilities had saved countless missions. Rounding out the team were Martinez from Marine Force Recon, Jackson from Delta Force, and Lieutenant Commander Phillips, whose experience in hostile territory extraction was unmatched. Nina had worked with each of them during training exercises, establishing the communication protocols that would keep them connected to base during the mission. She knew their voices, their habits, their quirks over the radio. Rodriguez always cleared his throat before important transmissions. Blake had a tendency to speak faster when under pressure. Cooper made clicking sounds with his tongue when concentrating on technical problems. These details, seemingly insignificant to others, formed the foundation of her ability to monitor their status and well-being during operations. The mission briefing had been classified at the highest levels, but Nina's clearance gave her access to the essential details. A high-value target had been located in a remote compound in the Hindu Kush Mountains, someone whose capture could potentially prevent a coordinated terrorist attack on American soil. The intelligence was time-sensitive, the window of opportunity narrow. The team would insert via helicopter at 0300 local time, establish a perimeter, and execute the extraction before dawn. Nina's role was to maintain constant communication with the operators, coordinate with satellite oversight, and provide real-time intelligence updates as the situation developed. She'd done this dozens of times before, but always with the knowledge that she'd be rotating into field operations soon. This time, Colonel Harrison had made it clear that her place was permanently behind the desk. "You're too valuable as an analyst," he'd said, though Nina suspected the real reason was different. The military, despite its progress, still struggled with the idea of women in direct combat roles. Her gender, combined with her relatively small stature, made her an easy target for exclusion when dangerous missions arose. She'd seen it happen to other qualified women, watched as their careers were channeled into support roles, while less capable men advanced to operational positions. The pre-mission routine was familiar and comforting. Nina ran through system checks, verified satellite positions, and tested backup communication channels. The primary communication array was state-of-the-art, utilizing a combination of military satellites and encrypted radio frequencies that provided seamless connectivity across vast distances. Secondary systems included high-frequency radio backups and emergency beacon protocols that could function even in severe weather conditions. As 0300 approached, Nina felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied every mission launch. Despite her frustration at being left behind, she cared deeply about the operator's safety. She'd spent countless hours studying their psychological profiles, understanding their stress responses, and learning to interpret the subtle changes in their voices that indicated fatigue, fear, or confusion. This knowledge made her exceptionally effective at her job, but it also meant she felt personally responsible for their well-being. The helicopter insertion went smoothly. Nina tracked the aircraft's progress on her primary monitor, while simultaneously monitoring weather conditions and potential threats on her auxiliary screens. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, confirming approach to the landing zone. Blackbird Bass, this is Nighthawk 1. Approaching LZ Alpha. Conditions favorable, preparing for insertion. Copy. Nighthawk 1. Nina responded, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she updated the mission log. Weather holding steady. No hostile activity detected in your sector. She watched the helicopter's icon move across the digital map, a small white triangle against the dark green terrain representation. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The team's insertion was textbook perfect. Nina listened as each operator confirmed their position and status, their voices clear and professional over the encrypted channel. Blackbird Bass, this is Raven 1, came Rodriguez's familiar voice. Team is on the ground, establishing perimeter. Moving to Phase 2. The code names were simple but effective. Each operator assigned a number that corresponded to their role in the mission hierarchy. Nina acknowledged the transmission and began tracking their movement toward the target compound. The satellite imagery showed a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley, surrounded by steep rocky terrain that would make approach difficult, but provide excellent cover. The team would have approximately 4 hours to complete their mission before the sun rose and their concealment advantages disappeared. For the first hour, everything proceeded flawlessly. Nina received regular status updates as the team navigated the treacherous mountain terrain, their GPS coordinates updating on her screen every few minutes. She coordinated with air support, ensuring that extraction helicopters remained on standby and that medical teams were prepared for any casualties. The atmosphere in the operations center was tense but controlled, with various specialists monitoring different aspects of the mission. The first sign of trouble came at 0347 hours. Nina was reviewing weather updates when she noticed that the team's GPS signals had become erratic. The dots representing their positions flickered intermittently on her screen, sometimes disappearing entirely before reappearing in slightly different locations. She frowned, checking her equipment for technical malfunctions, but all systems appeared to be functioning normally. Blackbird Bass, this is Raven 1. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the speakers, distorted by static. Experiencing some communication difficulties, signal strength dropping. Can you confirm our position? Nina quickly checked her displays, noting that the GPS coordinates were indeed unstable. This was unusual but not unprecedented in mountainous terrain where satellite signals could be blocked or reflected by geographic features. Raven 1, I show your position as grid reference, 345,782, approximately 2 kilometers from target. Are you experiencing equipment problems? Nina kept her voice calm and professional, though she felt a growing sense of unease. Communication problems during critical missions were every operator's nightmare, as they could quickly escalate into life-threatening situations. Negative on equipment problems, Rodriguez replied, his voice fading in and out. Terrain is interfering with signal quality. We're continuing to advance. We'll update when we reach better position. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Nina staring at her flickering monitors with growing concern. Over the next 30 minutes, the communication problems worsened. Nina received sporadic updates from the team, but the transmissions were increasingly fragmented and difficult to understand. She adjusted her equipment, switched to backup frequencies, and consulted with the technical specialists, but nothing seemed to improve the situation. The GPS tracking became completely unreliable, showing the team's positions jumping erratically across the map. Colonel Harrison appeared at Nina's workstation, his expression grave. "What's the situation, Gray?" he asked, studying the chaotic displays over her shoulder. Nina quickly briefed him on the communication problems, explaining the various troubleshooting measures she'd attempted. The colonel's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information, understanding the implications immediately. Could be natural interference, Nina suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. The terrain is extremely challenging, and solar activity has been elevated recently. It's possible that a combination of factors is causing the signal degradation. She continued working at her keyboard, adjusting settings and trying different communication protocols, but the results remained inconsistent. The colonel nodded grimly. Keep trying. We can't afford to lose contact with them. He moved away to consult with other specialists, leaving Nina alone with her flickering screens and growing sense of dread. She'd been in similar situations before, but something about this felt different. The communication problems were too severe, too comprehensive to be explained by natural interference alone. At 04:15 hours, Nina received what would be the last clear transmission from the team. Blake's voice came through the speakers, tense but controlled. Blackbird Bass, this is Raven 2. We've reached the target area, but something's wrong. The compound appears to be abandoned, and we're detecting electronic jamming equipment. This may be a trap. Request immediate extraction. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Nina staring at her silent equipment. She immediately tried to re-establish contact, switching between frequencies and adjusting her equipment settings. Raven 2, this is Blackbird Base. Please respond. Nothing. Any Raven element, this is Blackbird Base. Please respond. Still nothing. The screen showing the team's GPS positions flickered once more, then went completely dark. Nina felt her heart racing as she realized the full implications of the situation. 6 elite operators were somewhere in hostile territory, possibly under attack, and she'd lost all contact with them. The primary communication system had failed, the backup systems were non-functional, and the GPS tracking had gone completely dark. In the span of a few minutes, Operation Blackbird had transformed from a routine extraction mission into a potential disaster. Colonel Harrison returned to her workstation, his face pale with concern. "Status report," he demanded, though Nina's expression had already told him everything he needed to know. She quickly explained the situation, her voice remaining steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Other personnel were rushing between workstations, checking equipment, and trying to establish alternative communication methods. "We've lost all contact," Nina reported, her fingers still moving across her keyboard as she attempted different solutions. "Primary communications are down, backup systems are non-responsive, and GPS tracking has gone dark. Last transmission indicated they'd reached the target area but suspected it was a trap." She paused, looking up at the colonel. "Sir, I think they've been compromised." The colonel's expression hardened. "How long since last contact?" he asked, checking his watch. Nina glanced at her mission log, calculating the time that had elapsed since Blake's final transmission. 32 minutes, sir. Standard protocol calls for emergency extraction procedures if contact isn't re-established within 45 minutes. The operations center had become a hive of frantic activity. Technical specialists were checking equipment. Communication experts were trying alternative frequencies, and intelligence analysts were reviewing satellite imagery for signs of hostile activity. Despite all their efforts, the team remained completely out of contact, their fate unknown. Nina stared at her blank monitors, her mind racing through possible solutions. She'd exhausted all the standard communication protocols, tried every backup system in their arsenal, and consulted with every technical expert available. The team was effectively invisible, lost somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, with no way to call for help or request extraction. As the minutes ticked by, Nina felt a growing sense of desperation. These weren't just operational assets, they were people she'd worked with, trained with, and cared about. Rodriguez with his dry sense of humor, Blake with his dedication to his men, Cooper with his infectious enthusiasm for solving technical problems. They were counting on her to maintain their lifeline to safety, and she'd failed them. The 45-minute mark approached with no improvement in the situation. Colonel Harrison was consulting with his superiors, discussing emergency extraction protocols and the possibility of sending in a second team. Nina knew that such operations were extremely dangerous, especially when the original team's fate was unknown. Rescuers could easily walk into the same trap that had apparently claimed the first team. It was then that Nina remembered something from her early training, a conversation with an old-timer who'd worked satellite communications during the Cold War. He'd mentioned an older generation of military satellites, launched in the 1990s and officially decommissioned years ago. These satellites were supposedly non-functional, their orbits deteriorating, and their equipment obsolete. But Nina remembered the man's conspiratorial whisper. They never really turned them off, just mothballed them, waiting for an emergency. The thought seemed ridiculous at first. Even if the old satellites were still operational, Nina had no idea how to access them. The command codes would be classified beyond her clearance level, and the equipment needed to communicate with them probably didn't exist anymore. But as she watched the clock tick toward the emergency extraction deadline, desperation began to override logic. Nina quietly accessed the Pentagon's archived satellite database, using her DIA credentials to search for information about decommissioned communication satellites. The search results were limited and heavily redacted, but she found references to the Guardian network, a constellation of 6 satellites launched between 1992 and 1998. According to the official records, all 6 satellites had been decommissioned in 2003 due to outdated technology and budget constraints. However, Nina noticed something interesting in the technical specifications. The Guardian satellites had been designed with extreme durability in mind, built to survive electromagnetic pulses and maintain functionality even in degraded conditions. Their solar panels were oversized, their electronic components were hardened against radiation, and their orbital positions were chosen for maximum stability. These weren't typical communication satellites. They were designed to function when everything else failed. Nina's heart began to race as she realized the implications. If the Guardian satellites were still operational, they might provide an alternative communication path to the lost team. The frequency bands would be different, the encryption protocols would be archaic, but it might be possible to establish contact where modern systems had failed. The problem was access. Nina had no idea how to contact the Guardian network, assuming it still existed. The command codes would be buried in classified archives, the control systems would be obsolete, and she'd need specialized equipment to communicate with satellites that were decades old. Even if she could solve these problems, attempting to access a supposedly decommissioned military satellite network without authorization would be career suicide. Nina glanced around the operations center, noting that everyone was focused on their own desperate attempts to re-establish contact with the team. Colonel Harrison was in heated discussion with his superiors. Technical specialists were dismantling equipment to check for hardware failures, and intelligence analysts were reviewing intercepts for clues about what had happened to the team. Making a decision that would change everything, Nina quietly opened a secure terminal and began searching for information about the Guardian network's original control systems. She knew that older military satellites often use standardized command protocols, and there was a chance that some of the original equipment might still be available in storage facilities or forgotten server rooms. Her search led her to a reference buried deep in a maintenance manual from 1999. The document mentioned that Guardian network control had been transferred to a backup facility in the basement of the Pentagon, a facility that had been sealed and forgotten when the satellites were officially decommissioned. The manual included a floor plan and basic technical specifications, information that had apparently been overlooked when the files were declassified. Nina's pulse quickened as she realized what she was looking at. The backup control facility might still exist, and if the government's bureaucratic inefficiency was as legendary as everyone claimed, the equipment might still be there. It was a long shot, but it was the only option she could think of that hadn't been tried. She quickly printed the relevant pages, folded them carefully, and slipped them into her jacket pocket. Then she stood up and walked calmly toward Colonel Harrison, who was still engaged in heated discussion with his superiors. She waited for a brief pause in the conversation before addressing him. "Sir, I need to check something in the archives," she said, her voice steady and professional. "There might be some old equipment that could help with our communication problems." The colonel looked at her with tired eyes, his stress evident in the deep lines around his mouth. "How long will you need?" he asked. "Maybe 30 minutes, Nina replied, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. "I'll keep my radio on, in case the situation changes." The colonel nodded distractedly, already turning back to his conversation with the brass. Nina walked away, her heart pounding as she realized she was about to embark on an unauthorized mission that could either save 6 lives or destroy her career. The Pentagon's basement levels were a maze of forgotten storage rooms, abandoned offices, and obsolete equipment. Nina had been down here once before during her orientation, but that had been years ago, and she'd been part of a group tour. Now, armed with only the photocopied floor plan and her determination to help the lost team, she navigated the dimly lit corridors in search of the Guardian control facility. The basement smelled of dust and neglect, with the occasional hint of electronic equipment and old paper. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, many of them burned out or failing. Nina's footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as she followed the floor plan, turning left at a junction marked with faded numbers that corresponded to the map. After several wrong turns and dead ends, Nina found herself standing before a heavy steel door marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. The door was secured with an electronic lock that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1990s. Nina studied the lock, noting that it used a simple magnetic card reader, the kind that had been standard throughout the Pentagon before the security upgrades following 9/11. Nina tried her current access card, not expecting it to work, but hoping that some systems might still be connected to the central security network. The lock beeped twice and flashed red, indicating that her card was recognized, but access was denied. She tried again, holding the card against the reader for several seconds, but the result was the same. Frustrated but not defeated, Nina examined the door more carefully. She noticed that the frame was slightly warped, probably from decades of temperature changes and building settling. The electronic lock looked sophisticated, but the door itself seemed to have physical vulnerabilities. Nina remembered reading about security researchers who had discovered that older electronic locks could sometimes be bypassed if the door frame was compromised. She pressed her shoulder against the door while simultaneously presenting her card to the reader. The door moved slightly, and she felt the lock mechanism strain against the warped frame. She tried again, applying more pressure, and heard a faint clicking sound. On the third attempt, the lock mechanism finally gave way, and the door swung open. Nina stepped into a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. Banks of obsolete computers lined the walls, their CRT monitors dark and dusty. Control panels covered in switches, dials, and indicators stretched across several workstations. Cable management systems that had once been state-of-the-art now looked quaint and primitive compared to modern installations. The air in the room was stale and dry, with the distinctive smell of old electronics and ozone. Nina found a light switch and flipped it, hoping the power was still connected. To her amazement, the fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating a control center that looked like something from a Cold War movie. Everything was beige and gray, with the blocky utilitarian aesthetic that had dominated military technology in the 1990s. Nina pulled out the photocopied manual and began comparing the room's layout to the technical diagrams. She identified the main control console, a massive workstation that dominated the center of the room. According to the manual, this console provided direct access to the Guardian satellite network, assuming the satellites were still operational and the communication links were still active. She approached the main console and began examining the controls. The interface was completely different from modern systems, relying on physical switches, analog dials, and numeric displays instead of touchscreens and graphical interfaces. Labels on the controls were faded but still readable, indicating functions like SAT-16 Select, Uplink PWR, and Downlink Freak. Nina found what appeared to be a master power switch and flipped it cautiously. The console came to life with a series of beeps and clicks, various lights blinking as the system ran through its startup sequence. She watched in amazement as the displays began showing numbers and status indicators, suggesting that the equipment was not only functional but still connected to something. According to the manual, the Guardian network operated on specific frequency bands that were different from modern military communications. The satellites used an older encryption system that was supposedly more resistant to jamming, though less sophisticated than current standards. Nina began adjusting the controls according to the manual's instructions, setting frequencies and power levels that corresponded to the satellite network's operational parameters. The first challenge was determining which of the 6 Guardian satellites might still be operational. Nina found a status display that showed orbital positions and signal strength indicators. To her surprise, 4 of the 6 satellites were showing as active, their positions updated in real time. The other 2 showed as offline, but their orbital data was still being tracked. Nina selected the satellite that appeared to have the strongest signal and began configuring the communication parameters. The process was slow and unfamiliar, requiring her to translate between the manual's instructions and the actual controls. She had to adjust multiple settings simultaneously, balancing uplink power, downlink frequency, and encryption protocols to establish a stable connection. After nearly 20 minutes of careful adjustments, Nina achieved what she'd been hoping for, a connection to Guardian 3, one of the supposedly decommissioned satellites. The status display showed a solid link, and she could hear the faint carrier tone that indicated an active communication channel. Now came the real test. Could she use this archaic system to reach the lost team? Nina studied the manual section on ground-to-ground communications via satellite relay. The process was more complex than modern systems, requiring her to manually configure routing parameters and establish relay protocols. She had to specify the geographic area where she wanted to transmit, set power levels that would penetrate the mountainous terrain, and select frequencies that might be compatible with the team's modern equipment. The lost team's radios were designed to operate across multiple frequency bands, including some that overlapped with the Guardian network's capabilities. Nina calculated the appropriate settings and began transmitting a test signal, hoping that someone on the ground would recognize her attempts to establish contact. "Any Raven element, this is Blackbird base on emergency frequency," she broadcast, her voice echoing strangely through the old equipment. "Please respond if you can hear this transmission." She waited for a response, adjusting the controls to sweep across different frequencies in case the team's equipment had been damaged or reconfigured. For several minutes, there was nothing but static and the occasional burst of interference. Nina continued broadcasting, varying her message and adjusting the technical parameters. She was beginning to wonder if her desperate plan was doomed to failure when she heard something that made her heart leap. A faint, distorted voice emerging from the static. "Blackbird Bass, this is Raven 6, came a weak but unmistakable transmission. "Can barely read you, but we're alive. In deep trouble, need immediate extraction." Nina's hands trembled as she adjusted the controls to improve the signal quality. The voice became clearer, and she recognized it as belonging to Phillips, the naval officer who specialized in extraction operations. "Raven 6, this is Blackbird Bass," Nina responded, her voice barely containing her excitement. "You've been dark for over an hour. What's your situation?" She waited anxiously for the reply, knowing that every second of communication was precious and that the connection could be lost at any moment. "We're pinned down in a cave system approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the target," Phillips replied, his voice fading in and out. The compound was a trap, heavily defended. "We've got wounded and limited ammunition. They've been jamming our regular comms, but whatever frequency you're using seems to be getting through." Nina quickly plotted the position on her map, noting that it was consistent with the team's last known location. She began relaying the information to the operations center, while simultaneously maintaining the communication link. This was the breakthrough they'd been hoping for, proof that the team was alive, and specific information about their location and condition. "Raven 6, we're organizing extraction," Nina transmitted. "Can you provide more details about your situation? How many wounded, and what's your defensive capability?" She needed to gather as much information as possible to help plan the rescue operation. 3 wounded, including Blake who took shrapnel to the leg, Phillips replied. "We've got maybe 2 hours of ammunition left if they keep pressing us. The cave system provides good cover, but we're trapped. They've got heavy weapons positioned to cover the approaches." Nina relayed this information to the operations center, where Colonel Harrison and his team were already mobilizing rescue assets. Helicopters were being prepared, medical teams were standing by, and additional operators were being briefed on the situation. The successful reestablishment of communication had transformed the crisis from a complete unknown into a manageable rescue operation. But the communication link through the Guardian satellite was tenuous and unreliable. Nina had to constantly adjust the controls to maintain signal quality, and there were frequent interruptions when the satellite moved out of optimal position or when atmospheric conditions interfered with the transmission. She realized that maintaining this connection would require her full attention and expertise. Over the next hour, Nina became the crucial link between the trapped team and their rescuers. She relayed tactical information, coordinated with medical personnel about the wounded operator's conditions, and provided real-time updates on the team's status. The old Guardian system, despite its obsolete technology, was proving more reliable than the modern equipment that had failed so catastrophically. The rescue operation was complex and dangerous. The extraction team had to navigate the same treacherous terrain that had challenged the original mission, but now they were operating in daylight with the knowledge that hostile forces were actively engaged with American B operators. Nina coordinated between multiple aircraft, ground teams, and support units, using the Guardian satellite as the primary communication link. As the rescue helicopters approached the team's position, Nina found herself in the unprecedented position of directing military operations from a forgotten basement room using equipment that was older than some of the operators involved. She could hear the sound of gunfire and explosions through the radio, Philip's voice becoming increasingly tense as the enemy forces intensified their assault on the cave position. "Blackbird Bass, they're making a major push," Phillips reported, his words nearly lost in the sound of automatic weapons fire. "We're running low on ammunition and grenades. How long until extraction arrives?" Nina checked her coordination displays, calculating the distance and timing based on the rescue helicopter's reported positions. "Raven 6, extraction is approximately 12 minutes out," she replied. "Hold your position and conserve ammunition. Air support is moving into position to provide cover for the extraction." Nina was coordinating with attack helicopters that were preparing to suppress the enemy forces, buying precious time for the rescue operation. The next few minutes were the most intense of Nina's career. She found herself directing close air support, coordinating multiple aircraft in a complex airspace, and maintaining communication with ground forces, all while working with equipment that belonged in a museum. The responsibility was overwhelming, but she drew on her training and experience to maintain focus and professionalism. The extraction itself was a masterpiece of military coordination. Attack helicopters provided suppressive fire, while transport helicopters moved into position near the cave system. Nina relayed tactical information in real time, helping the pilots navigate the treacherous terrain while avoiding enemy fire. She could hear the rescue team's radio chatter as they rappelled down to the cave entrance and began evacuating the wounded operators. "Blackbird Bass, we've got all personnel secured and are lifting off," came the welcome report from the extraction team leader. "6 souls on board, 3 wounded but stable. ETA to medical facility is 25 minutes. Nina felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized that the mission, despite its disastrous beginning, was ending successfully. As the rescue helicopters flew toward safety, Nina began the process of shutting down the Guardian communication system. She carefully followed the manual's procedures, ensuring that the equipment was properly powered down and secured. The old satellite network had performed flawlessly when modern systems had failed, proving that sometimes older technology could be more reliable than its newer counterparts. Nina made her way back through the Pentagon's basement corridors, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. She'd successfully used a supposedly decommissioned satellite network to save 6 lives, but she'd also violated numerous regulations and protocols in the process. The door to the Guardian control room showed obvious signs of forced entry, and her unauthorized access would be difficult to explain. When she returned to the operations center, she found Colonel Harrison waiting for her with a mixture of relief and suspicion. The successful rescue operation had lifted everyone's spirits, but questions were already being asked about how communication had been reestablished when all official systems had failed. "Gray, where the hell did you find that communication channel?" the colonel asked, his expression unreadable. "The technical teams are stumped. They can't figure out how you managed to reach the team when everything else failed." Nina took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the course of her career. "Sir, I access the Guardian satellite network, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. It's an older system that was supposedly decommissioned, but I found the control equipment in the basement and managed to establish a connection. She waited for his reaction, prepared for anger, disciplinary action, or even criminal charges. Instead, Colonel Harrison's expression slowly changed from suspicion to amazement. You mean the Cold War satellites? Those were decommissioned 20 years ago. He stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications. You're telling me you single-handedly activated a dead satellite network and used it to coordinate a rescue operation? Yes, sir, Nina replied simply. The equipment was still functional, and 4 of the 6 satellites were still operational. I used the technical manuals to configure the system and establish communication with the team. She handed him the photocopied manual pages, which were now crumpled and stained from her adventure in the basement. The colonel studied the documents, his expression growing more incredulous with each page. Gray, do you have any idea what you've done? You've just proven that our most classified satellite network is still operational and vulnerable to unauthorized access. This is either the biggest security breach in Pentagon history or the most impressive piece of initiative I've ever seen. Over the next several hours, Nina found herself at the center of a bureaucratic whirlwind. Security investigators wanted to know how she'd accessed the classified facility. Technical experts wanted to understand how she'd operated the obsolete equipment. And intelligence officials wanted to assess the implications of the Guardian network's continued operation. Her actions had saved 6 lives, but they'd also exposed significant vulnerabilities in the military's communication systems. The investigation revealed that the Guardian satellites had indeed been maintained in a standby status, despite official claims that they'd been decommissioned. The network was part of a classified contingency plan, designed to provide backup communications in case of catastrophic failure of modern systems. Nina's unauthorized access had demonstrated that the system was both functional and vulnerable, leading to immediate security reviews and policy changes. As the initial shock wore off, Nina began to realize that her actions had fundamentally changed her career trajectory. She was no longer just another analyst stuck behind a desk. She was the woman who had taken control of a satellite network and single-handedly coordinated a rescue operation. The story spread quickly through military channels, with different versions emphasizing different aspects of her achievement. The rescued team members were effusive in their praise for Nina's actions. Rodriguez, despite his injuries, made a point of thanking her personally for maintaining the communication link that had saved their lives. Blake, recovering from his shrapnel wounds, told anyone who would listen that Nina had performed better under pressure than most operators he'd worked with in the field. Colonel Harrison found himself in the unusual position of defending Nina's actions to his superiors, while simultaneously recommending her for both commendation and disciplinary action. The unauthorized access to classified facilities was a serious violation, but the successful rescue operation had vindicated her decision to take extraordinary measures. She violated protocol, but she saved 6 lives, he explained to the review board. If we punish her for showing initiative and technical expertise, we'll be sending the wrong message to our analysts. Nina Gray didn't just monitor a communication system, she became the communication system. When everything else failed. The Pentagon's response was characteristically bureaucratic and contradictory. Nina received both a letter of reprimand for unauthorized access to classified facilities and a commendation for exceptional performance in a crisis situation. The letter of reprimand would remain in her personnel file, but the commendation would be submitted for consideration for higher honors. More importantly, Nina's actions had attracted attention from the highest levels of the military hierarchy. She received a personal call from a general she'd never met, congratulating her on her actions and inviting her to consider a transfer to a new position that would better utilize her unique skills. The offer was vague, but intriguing, suggesting opportunities for advancement that would never have been available in her previous role. The technical aspects of Nina's achievement were equally significant. Her successful use of the Guardian network had demonstrated that older, supposedly obsolete systems could provide critical backup capabilities when modern equipment failed. The Pentagon immediately began reviewing its inventory of mothballed communication assets, looking for other systems that might be maintained in standby status. Nina found herself in demand as a technical consultant, called upon to explain how she'd managed to operate the obsolete equipment and establish communication with modern radios. Her experience became a case study in adaptability and resourcefulness, used to train other analysts in emergency procedures and contingency planning. The story of Nina's achievement spread beyond military circles, eventually reaching the attention of defense contractors and technology companies. She received several job offers from private sector organizations, each offering significantly higher salaries and more challenging work than her current position. The offers were tempting, but Nina realized that her true satisfaction came from serving her country and supporting the operators who put their lives at risk. As the weeks passed, Nina reflected on the events that had transformed her from a desk-bound analyst into a figure of legend within the intelligence community. She'd proven that determination and technical expertise could overcome institutional barriers and bureaucratic limitations. Her actions had saved lives and demonstrated that sometimes the most important contributions came from unexpected sources. The Guardian network was eventually officially reactivated, with updated security protocols and modern control systems. Nina was appointed as the technical lead for the modernization project, finally receiving the recognition and responsibility she'd always desired. She worked closely with the original team members, now recovered from their injuries, to develop new communication protocols that combined the reliability of older systems with the capabilities of modern technology. Rodriguez, now fully recovered, often visited Nina's new office to discuss technical improvements and share stories from the field. "You know," he told her one day, "when I heard your voice coming through that static, I thought I was hallucinating. But then I realized it was just Nina Gray, doing what she always does, making the impossible possible." Blake, despite his promotion to a new command position, made sure to stay in touch with Nina. He understood better than most how her actions had saved not just his life, but the lives of his entire team. "People ask me about that mission," he said, "and I tell them it wasn't about the operators in the field, it was about the woman back home who refused to give up on us." The months following the rescue operation brought changes that Nina had never imagined possible. The Pentagon's review of the Guardian incident had resulted in a complete overhaul of emergency communication protocols, with Nina's actions serving as the foundation for new training programs and contingency procedures. She found herself traveling to military installations around the world, sharing her experience and helping other analysts develop the skills needed to handle crisis situations. Cooper, the Air Force technical sergeant who had been part of the rescue team, became one of Nina's closest collaborators in developing the new communication systems. His electronic warfare expertise, combined with her satellite communication knowledge, created a partnership that pushed the boundaries of military technology. "Nina doesn't just understand the equipment," he explained to a group of visiting officials. "She understands how to make it work when everything else fails." The private sector job offers continued to arrive, each one more lucrative than the last. Defense contractors wanted to hire Nina as a consultant. Technology companies offered her executive positions, and research institutions proposed joint ventures that would have made her wealthy beyond her dreams. But Nina found herself increasingly committed to her military career, driven by a sense of purpose that money couldn't replace. Her new position as Director of Emergency Communications Systems came with responsibilities that extended far beyond her original analyst role. Nina now oversaw a team of 30 specialists, managed a budget of $50 million, and reported directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on matters related to communication security and redundancy. The transformation from overlooked analyst to key decision-maker had been rapid and overwhelming. The psychological impact of the rescue operation continued to affect Nina in unexpected ways. She'd always been confident in her technical abilities, but the experience of directing a life-or-death operation had revealed leadership qualities she didn't know she possessed. The responsibility of knowing that 6 lives depended on her decisions had been terrifying, but it had also been exhilarating in a way that routine analytical work never could be. Nina's relationship with her colleagues had fundamentally changed. Where once she'd been seen as a competent but unremarkable analyst, she was now viewed as someone who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances. The respect was gratifying, but it also came with expectations that were sometimes difficult to meet. People looked to her for solutions to problems that had no easy answers, expecting her to work miracles with the same determination she'd shown during the rescue operation. The investigation into the Guardian Network's security vulnerabilities had revealed a disturbing truth about the Pentagon's information management systems. Dozens of supposedly decommissioned programs were still operational, their existence known only to a handful of personnel who had retired or been transferred to other duties. Nina's unauthorized access had exposed a massive gap in institutional knowledge that threatened national security. Colonel Harrison, now promoted to general, had become Nina's strongest advocate within the Pentagon hierarchy. He understood that her success stemmed not from rule-breaking, but from a willingness to take initiative when institutional procedures proved inadequate. "Nina Gray didn't break the rules," he explained to skeptical superiors. "She showed us that our rules were broken." The rescued team members had become something of a brotherhood, united by their shared experience and their gratitude to Nina. They maintained regular contact with each other and with her, forming an informal network that extended across different military branches and specialties. Jackson, the Delta Force operator, had requested a transfer to work with Nina's new department, bringing his operational experience to bear on communication system design. Martinez, the Marine Force recon specialist, had taken a different path, using his experience from the rescue operation to develop new training programs for operators facing communication failures. His courses emphasized adaptability and resourcefulness, teaching soldiers to maintain effectiveness even when standard equipment failed. "Nina Gray saved our lives by thinking outside the box," he told his students, "and that's exactly what you need to do when everything goes wrong." The technical aspects of Nina's achievement continued to generate interest from academic researchers and military historians. Her successful use of obsolete equipment to accomplish a mission that defeated modern systems had become a case study in several universities, illustrating the importance of understanding fundamental principles rather than relying solely on current technology. Graduate students wrote dissertations, analyzing her decision-making process and the technical challenges she'd overcome. Nina's parents, who had always supported her military career despite their concerns about her safety, finally understood the true nature of her work. Her father, a retired engineer, was fascinated by the technical details of the Guardian network and spent hours discussing satellite communication theory with his daughter. Her mother, initially worried about Nina's increased responsibilities, eventually came to see her daughter's success as validation of the strength and intelligence she'd always recognized. The media attention surrounding Nina's story had been carefully managed by Pentagon public relations specialists, who understood both the positive and negative implications of publicizing her achievement. While they wanted to celebrate her success and demonstrate the military's commitment to recognizing exceptional performance, they also needed to protect operational security and avoid encouraging, quote, unauthorized access to classified systems. The carefully crafted press releases described Nina's actions in general terms, emphasizing her technical expertise and dedication, while avoiding specific details about the equipment she'd used or the procedures she'd followed. The story became a symbol of American military ingenuity and the importance of supporting personnel who worked behind the scenes to ensure operational success. Nina's influence on military communication doctrine extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the rescue operation. Her experience had demonstrated the critical importance of maintaining backup systems and ensuring that personnel were trained to use them effectively. The Pentagon allocated significant resources to identifying and maintaining legacy systems that might prove crucial in emergency situations. The relationship between Nina and the operators she'd saved evolved into something deeper than professional gratitude. These men had trusted her with their lives, and she had proven worthy of that trust through her actions. The bond forged in crisis had created a network of mutual support that transcended normal military hierarchies and would last for the rest of their careers. Phillips, the naval officer who had been her primary contact during the rescue, had become particularly close to Nina. His extraction expertise complemented her communication skills, and they worked together on several projects designed to improve coordination between ground teams and support personnel. "Nina doesn't just talk to operators," he explained to new personnel. She understands what we need before we know we need it. The long-term implications of Nina's success were still being felt throughout the military establishment. Her story had become part of the culture, a reminder that individual initiative and technical competence could overcome institutional failures. Young analysts and operators were encouraged to study her example, not as a model for rule-breaking, but as an illustration of the importance of understanding systems thoroughly enough to adapt them when, quote, circumstances demanded. Nina's new responsibilities included oversight of the military's most sensitive communication projects, work that required her to travel frequently and interact with personnel at the highest levels of government. She found herself briefing cabinet members, consulting with intelligence agency directors, and participating in strategic planning sessions that shaped national security policy. The transformation from desk-bound analyst to key decision-maker had been complete. The technical challenges of modernizing military communication systems, while maintaining the reliability that had made the Guardian network successful, proved to be enormously complex. Nina's team worked with contractors, researchers, and foreign allies to develop new approaches that combined cutting-edge technology with proven principles. Their work would influence military communication systems for decades to come. The personal cost of Nina's success was significant but manageable. The increased responsibility and public attention had made her life more complicated, but she had adapted to the changes with the same determination she'd shown during the rescue operation. Her relationships with family and friends had evolved to accommodate her new status, and she'd learned to balance her professional obligations with her personal needs. The story of Nina Gray had become more than just an account of one woman's achievement during a crisis. It had become a symbol of the importance of technical expertise, individual initiative, and the willingness to take calculated risks when lives were at stake. Her success had changed not just her own career, but the entire culture of military communication systems, demonstrating that sometimes the most important contributions came from the most unexpected sources. As Nina stood in her new office, looking out at the Pentagon's bustling corridors, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She'd started as a simple analyst, told to stay behind while others took the risks and received the recognition. But when the moment came to prove herself, she'd seized the opportunity and demonstrated that her contributions were just as valuable as those of the operators in the field. The story would be told and retold for years to come, inspiring other analysts to push beyond their assigned roles and prove their worth through action rather than words. Nina Gray had shown that in the modern military, the most important battles were often fought not on foreign battlefields, but in forgotten basement rooms, by dedicated professionals who refused to accept failure as an option. Her legacy would endure not just in the technical systems she'd helped create, but in the cultural change she'd inspired. The military had learned that expertise and determination could be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the people told to stay behind were exactly the ones needed to save the day. Nina Gray had taken control of more than just a satellite network. She had taken control of her own destiny and proven that a simple woman could change the world